Neon flickered against the rain-slicked pavement, casting long, fractured shadows across the diner's foggy windows. Inside, the air hung heavy with the comforting heavy scent of burnt coffee, fried onions, and aged vinyl. Two men sat perfectly still in the back corner booth, carrying a profound silence that only came from surviving things most people couldn't even fathom. They wanted nothing more than a hot, greasy meal and the fleeting illusion of a normal, quiet civilian night. But the sharp chime of the front doorbell didn't just announce another customer stepping out of the Pacific Coast cold. It announced a reckoning. A small-town badge with a dangerous ego was about to pick a fight with the quietest, deadliest men in the room. The rusted sign outside read O'Connor's Galley, a relic of a diner perched on the ragged edge of a coastal highway just 40 minutes north of Coronado, California. It was 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, the kind of hour that belonged exclusively to insomniacs, long-haul truckers, and ghosts. Chief Petty Officer Derek Washington and Petty Officer Second Class Samuel Rivers fit somewhere into the latter category. They had touched down on U.S. soil less than 48 hours ago, returning from a classified, grueling 7-month deployment in the Horn of Africa, the kind of deployment that stripped a man down to his rawest nerves. Their bodies were battered, bearing the invisible and visible weight of continuous operations, carrying the aches of carried gear, hard landings, and the heavy burden of command. Derek, a 15-year veteran of the Navy SEALs with the scars to prove it, methodically stirred his black coffee. Across from him, Samuel, younger but seasoned by the brutal realities of their trade, was halfway through a plate of steak and eggs. They were dressed in plain, unremarkable civilian clothes, faded denim, dark, unmarked hoodies, and heavy boots. They didn't look like the Hollywood version of elite operators. There were no flashy tattoos visible, no loud, boastful behavior. They were perfectly engineered chameleons, trained to blend into the background, to observe without being observed. Their posture, however, gave them away to anyone trained to look. They sat with their backs to the wall, eyes naturally and unconsciously tracking the exits, the subtle movements of the only waitress, a tired woman named Maggie, and the rhythmic sweep of the headlights outside. The peace of the diner was shattered by the harsh, grating sound of an idling police cruiser pulling up directly to the curb, its tires scraping against the concrete. Officer Wyatt Mitchell stepped out of the vehicle, adjusting his duty belt with a practiced, arrogant hitch. Wyatt was a man who wore his uniform like a king's mantle. He had spent his entire life in this county, festering in the shadow of his own inadequacies. He was the kind of cop who had been rejected from military service years ago due to psychological flags, a deep-seated inability to handle authority, and a troubling inclination toward unwarranted aggression. Instead of looking inward, Wyatt had pivoted to local law enforcement, leveraging his uncle's political connections on the city council to secure a badge. For 6 years, he had treated the night shift along the highway as his personal fiefdom, terrorizing teenagers, harassing out-of-towners, and accumulating a thick, heavily redacted file of civilian complaints that always miraculously disappeared. Wyatt pushed through the diner doors, the bell clattering aggressively. The cold wind swept in with him, biting at the warmth of the room. He took off his mirrored aviators, an absurd accessory for the middle of the night, and hooked them into his shirt pocket. He scanned the room with predatory intent. His eyes passed over the sleeping trucker at the counter, passed over Maggie, who was wiping down the pie display, and landed directly on the corner booth. 2 black men, strangers, in his town, at 2 a.m. In Wyatt's deeply prejudiced, power-hungry mind, the narrative wrote itself instantly. They didn't look local. They didn't look wealthy. They looked like an opportunity to exert control. He felt the familiar, toxic rush of adrenaline, the intoxicating thrill of absolute authority. He didn't see 2 men who had spent the last 7 months hunting warlords and keeping the world from spinning off its axis. He saw easy targets. "Evening, Wyatt," Maggie said, her voice tight with forced politeness. She knew his reputation. Everyone in town did. "Coffee?" "The usual." "Not right now, Maggie," Wyatt said, his voice a low, theatrical rumble. He kept his eyes locked on the corner booth. He rested his right hand casually on the butt of his sidearm, an intimidation tactic he used to establish dominance before a single word was spoken. "Looks like we got some folks who are a long way from home." Derek took a slow, measured sip of his coffee. He didn't look up, but his peripheral vision had tracked Wyatt from the moment the cruiser's tires hit the curb. Underneath the table, Samuel's right foot tapped once against Derek's boot. A silent, universal signal. Threat assessed. Waiting for your lead. Keep eating, Sammy, Derek murmured. His voice so quiet, it barely carried over the hum of the neon beer sign in the window. Let him do his dance. Wyatt swaggered across the linoleum floor, his heavy boots intentionally loud. He stopped right at the edge of their booth, invading their personal space, looming over them with a manufactured air of menace. He waited for them to look up, to show fear, to show deference. Derek finally raised his eyes. They were completely flat, void of any emotion. It was the look of a man who had stared down heavily armed insurgents in the dead of night. Wyatt's aggressive posture barely registered as a blip on his radar. "Can we help you, officer?" Derek asked, his tone perfectly polite. Perfectly neutral. Wyatt sneered, leaning in closer. "Just doing a routine check. We've had some suspicious activity in the area lately. Break-ins. You boys match a description." The lie was as transparent as the diner's front window. There had been no break-ins. The police scanner, which Derek and Samuel both knew how to read like the back of their hands, had been dead silent for the past 3 hours. "Is that right?" Samuel asked, setting his fork down with deliberate slowness. He wiped his mouth with a paper napkin. "What description would that be?" "Exactly." Wyatt's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being questioned. He was used to stammering apologies and nervous compliance. 2 males, dark clothing. Driving through town at odd hours. Now. I'm going to need to see some identification from both of you. Right now. Derek didn't move. He leaned back against the vinyl seat, keeping his hands entirely visible on the tabletop. It was a tactical de-escalation maneuver, designed to remove any physical excuse for the officer to draw a weapon. "Officer," Derek said calmly, "we're just passing through. We stopped for a meal. We haven't committed any traffic violations, and eating steak and eggs isn't a crime. Unless you have reasonable, articulable suspicion that we have committed, are committing, or are about to commit a crime, we aren't obligated to provide identification." Wyatt's face flushed a deep, ugly red. The textbook recitation of Terry v. Ohio rights infuriated him. In his world, the law was whatever he said it was. "Listen to me very carefully, smartass," Wyatt hissed, leaning closer, his hand unsnapping the retention strap on his holster. The sharp click echoed loudly in the quiet diner. Maggie gasped from behind the counter, taking a step back toward the kitchen doors. "You don't tell me what the law is. You're in my jurisdiction now. You are suspects in an active investigation. You will hand over your IDs, or I will pull you out of that booth and arrest you for obstruction and resisting." Samuel let out a slow, controlled breath. In his head, he ran through the geometry of the room. Distance to the officer. 2 feet. Officer's hand on weapon. Body armor present. Backup likely minutes away. Samuel knew he could disarm Wyatt in roughly 1.4 seconds. He could break the man's wrist, strip the Glock, and have him pinned to the linoleum before the waitress even had time to scream. But that was the snare. That was how careers ended and lives were ruined by men like Wyatt. They had survived war zones by being disciplined. They weren't going to lose their freedom to a rogue cop in a greasy spoon diner. "Sammy," Derek said quietly, a command hidden beneath a casual tone. "Give him your ID, Chief," Samuel whispered back, a hint of protest in his voice. "Do it." Samuel reached slowly, deliberately, using just his thumb and index finger, into his front pocket. "I am reaching for my wallet, officer," Samuel narrated, keeping his movements painfully slow. He pulled out a worn leather bifold and extracted a rigid, white plastic card. It wasn't a California driver's license. It was a Department of Defense Common Access card, CAC. He placed it on the table and slid it toward Wyatt. Derek did the same, placing his own military ID next to Samuel's. Wyatt looked down at the cards. He didn't pick them up immediately. He stared at the bold letters. United States Armed Forces. He saw the pay grades. E7 and E5. He saw the branch. U.S. Navy. And below that, the distinct, highly classified operational code that denoted naval special warfare. For a fleeting second, a flicker of doubt crossed Wyatt's eyes, but his ego violently suffocated it. To back down now would be to admit defeat. It would mean these two men had won. It would mean his authority was hollow. His mind desperately scrambled to justify his prejudice, landing on a delusion that fit his narrative. "You think I'm stupid?" Wyatt laughed, a harsh, barking sound. He snatched the cards off the table, barely glancing at the sophisticated holograms and microchips. "You think you can buy these at a novelty shop and pass them off to me? Stolen valor is a federal offense, boys, and possessing forged government documents is a felony. You just upgraded yourselves from suspects to inmates." Derek's expression finally changed. The polite neutrality vanished, replaced by a cold, hardened steel that made the temperature in the room feel like it dropped 10 degrees. "Officer Mitchell," Derek said, reading the man's name tag for the first time, "I highly suggest you run those numbers through your dispatch. You are making a profound mistake. One that you will not be able to walk back." "Shut your mouth," Wyatt shouted, drawing his taser with his left hand and pointing it squarely at Derek's chest. "Hands on the table. Both of you. Turn around and put your hands behind your backs." Now, Maggie, terrified, fumbled for the diner's landline phone behind the counter, but Wyatt snapped his head toward her. "Put the phone down, Maggie. Do not interfere in police business." She froze, tears welling in her eyes, her hands shaking. Derek and Samuel did not turn around. They did not put their hands behind their backs. They remained seated, hands flat on the table, staring up at the taser with absolute, unnerving composure. They had had genuine automatic weapons pointed at their heads by men who actually knew how to kill. A trembling, insecure cop with a piece of yellow plastic was a nuisance, not a terror. "Officer," Samuel said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the undeniable weight of a warning. "If you discharge that weapon, you will be assaulting a federal employee without cause. You have our identification. You have a radio. Run the names." Wyatt was hyperventilating now, caught in the trap of his own escalating aggression. He grabbed his shoulder mic. "Dispatch. This is Unit 4. I need backup at O'Connor's on Highway 9. Code 3. 2 non-compliant suspects, actively resisting. Send everything you've got. Copy. Unit 4. Backup is en route. ETA, 3 minutes. You boys are done," Wyatt spat, keeping the taser aimed at Derek. "When my boys get here, we're dragging you out of this booth by your teeth." Derek looked at Samuel. The unspoken communication passed between them again. They needed a circuit breaker. This local precinct was about to swarm the diner, and given Wyatt's narrative over the radio, the arriving officers would come in hot, guns drawn, expecting a violent fight. If one nervous rookie's finger slipped, people would die. "Sammy," Derek said calmly, "make the call." Wyatt's eyes went wide. "Keep your hands where I can see them. I will drop you right here." "My hands are on the table, officer," Samuel said, "but my smartwatch is on my wrist. I am using voice command to make a phone call. I am not moving my hands." "Cancel the call," Wyatt screamed. "Hey Siri," Samuel said clearly, ignoring the raving cop. "Call Captain Sinclair. Private." The name hit the air like a physical blow, though Wyatt didn't immediately process the weight of it. The phone rang twice. A deep, gruff voice answered on the smartwatch speaker. "Rivers. It's 0200. I sincerely hope you are either calling to tell me you're dead, or you have a damn good reason for waking me up on my first week of vacation. Apologies, sir," Samuel said, his tone shifting immediately to crisp military deference. "Chief Washington and I have encountered a slight logistical issue on our way back to base." "What kind of issue?" The voice on the watch instantly lost its sleepiness, replaced by sharp, commanding alertness. Captain Robert Sinclair was a legend in San Diego law enforcement. He was the precinct captain for the very district Oakhaven sat in, a man known for his brutal, uncompromising integrity. But more importantly, before he wore a police captain's stars, Robert Sinclair wore the trident. He was a former Navy SEAL commander who had transitioned to law enforcement 2 decades ago. He knew Derek Washington personally. He knew Samuel Rivers. He knew exactly what kind of men they were. "We are currently at O'Connor's diner," Samuel reported calmly. "We are being detained at taser point by an Officer Wyatt Mitchell. He has confiscated our DOD IDs, claimed they are forged, and has called in a Code 3 for non-compliant suspects." There was a dead, terrifying silence on the other end of the line. When Captain Sinclair spoke again, his voice was deathly quiet, possessing a lethal edge that made Wyatt flinch despite himself. "Put him on speaker," Sinclair ordered. "He is on speaker, Captain," Samuel replied. "Officer Mitchell." Sinclair's voice emanated from the small device on Samuel's wrist, echoing off the diner walls. "This is Captain Robert Sinclair, your commanding officer." Wyatt swallowed hard. His face, previously flushed red with rage, suddenly drained of all color, turning a sickly, pallid gray. The taser in his hand trembled violently. "See, Captain?" he stammered. "Sir, I have a situation here. These two suspects—" "Shut your damn mouth, Mitchell," Sinclair roared, the volume suddenly spiking, rattling the speaker. "You do not speak. You listen. You are currently pointing a weapon at two of the most highly decorated active-duty special operators in the United States military. Men who have spilled blood for this country while you were writing parking tickets and harassing my civilians." "Sir," their IDs Wyatt tried to interrupt, desperation clawing at his throat. "I said shut your mouth," Sinclair bellowed. "I know exactly who they are. I know them. I know their service records, and I know your service record, Mitchell, which is a steaming pile of civilian complaints and excessive force violations that I have been building a case to terminate you over." Wyatt slowly lowered the taser. The reality of the nightmare he had just constructed for himself was beginning to crash down upon him. "Now," Sinclair continued, his voice dropping back to a lethal whisper, "you are going to slowly holster your weapon. You are going to step back 5 paces. You are going to cancel that Code 3 with dispatch immediately. And then you are going to stand perfectly still and wait." "Wait for what, sir?" Wyatt asked, his voice cracking, sounding like a terrified child. "Wait for me," Sinclair said. "I am putting my boots on. I will be at that diner in 12 minutes. And when I arrive, Mitchell, I am taking your badge, I am taking your gun, and I am ending your career." The line went dead. The silence that followed the click of the smartwatch was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. The diner, previously filled with the low hum of the refrigerator and the gentle patter of rain against the glass, suddenly felt like a vacuum chamber. Wyatt Mitchell stood paralyzed. The yellow plastic of his taser, which only moments ago felt like an extension of his absolute authority, now felt like a live grenade glued to his palm. He looked at the device, then down at the two men sitting comfortably in the booth. Derek finally lowered his hands, resting them flat on his thighs. He didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. His expression remained the same flat, impenetrable slate it had been since Wyatt first approached the table. That lack of reaction terrified Wyatt more than if the man had jumped across the table and struck him. It was the terrifying stillness of an apex predator watching a trapped animal hyperventilate. "I suggest you holster that, officer," Derek said, his voice quiet, devoid of malice but heavy with inevitability. "Your hand is shaking. The safety is off. If you accidentally discharge those prongs into me, Captain Sinclair will not just fire you. He will likely ensure you spend the next 5 years in a federal penitentiary for assaulting a serviceman." Wyatt swallowed hard, the sound audible in the quiet room. With trembling, clumsy fingers, he flicked the safety switch and shoved the taser back into its holster, missing the receptacle on the first try. He took one step back, then another, until his back hit the edge of the counter. "Maggie," Samuel called out gently, not looking back, his eyes remaining locked on Wyatt. "Could I get a warm-up on this coffee? It's getting a little cold." Maggie, who was still clutching a damp dish towel to her chest, let out a breathless, half-hysterical chuckle. She grabbed the glass carafe with shaking hands and moved to the table, keeping a wide berth around the petrified police officer. She poured the dark liquid, her eyes darting nervously toward the highway. "Thank you, ma'am," Samuel said, offering her a warm, genuine smile. "Sorry about the noise." Before Maggie could respond, the wail of sirens pierced the night. It started as a distant, mournful howl, quickly multiplying and escalating into a deafening, multitonal shriek. The flashing red and blue strobe lights cut through the fog, bouncing violently off the diner's windows and painting the interior in harsh, chaotic colors. Wyatt flinched as the screech of heavy tires tearing across the wet asphalt announced the arrival of the cavalry he had so eagerly summoned. 3 patrol cruisers slammed into the parking lot, angling themselves aggressively toward the diner's entrance. Doors kicked open, and the sharp, distinct sounds of pump-action shotguns being racked and sidearms being drawn echoed through the rain. This was the most dangerous moment of the night. Derek and Samuel knew it immediately. Wyatt had called in a Code 3, non-compliant suspects actively resisting. The arriving officers were stepping into what they believed was a violent, potentially deadly confrontation with an officer in distress. Adrenaline would be redlining. Trigger fingers would be tense. "Wyatt," Derek snapped, his voice suddenly carrying the sharp crack of a command. "Get to the door. Tell them to stand down. Now." But Wyatt was caught in a severe psychological vapor lock. His brain, unable to process the rapid, catastrophic shift in his reality, simply shut down. He stared blankly at the glass doors, watching his heavily armed colleagues stack up on the entrance, preparing to breach. "He's frozen, Chief," Samuel noted, his body tensing, readying for explosive movement. "I see it. Hands on the table, Sammy. Palms up. Do not flinch," Derek ordered. The diner door was kicked open, the bell violently ripped from its hinges. 4 officers poured into the narrow space, their weapons raised, flashlight beams violently sweeping the room. "Police! Nobody move! Show me your hands!" The lead officer, a young, wide-eyed sergeant named Morris, screamed. His gun swept past Maggie, past the terrified trucker who had hit the floor, and locked onto the corner booth. "We are unarmed. Hands are visible and empty," Derek bellowed, his voice projecting through the chaos with absolute, undeniable authority. It wasn't the voice of a panicked civilian. It was the voice of a man who commanded battlefields. It cut through the adrenaline-fueled haze of the officers, forcing a momentary pause. "Wyatt, report!" Sergeant Morris yelled, keeping his weapon trained on Derek. "Are you hit? Where is the threat?" Wyatt blinked, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. It's..." he stammered. His bravado entirely evaporated. "The situation is Code 4, Sergeant," Derek called out calmly, keeping his eyes on the barrel of Morris's gun. "Officer Mitchell made an erroneous call. We are active-duty military personnel. Our identification is on the table. Captain Sinclair is en route and has ordered Officer Mitchell to stand down." The mention of the captain's name acted like a bucket of ice water on the responding officers. Morris frowned, his eyes darting from the perfectly calm men in the booth to the sweating, pale, trembling form of Wyatt Mitchell leaning against the counter. "Wyatt?" Morris demanded, lowering his weapon slightly but keeping it at the low ready. "Is that true? Did you call the old man?" "Aye." "He." Wyatt looked at the floor, unable to meet his sergeant's eyes. "Yes." Morris let out a long, heavy string of curses. He holstered his weapon and signaled for the other 3 officers to do the same. The tension in the room rapidly deflated, replaced by a thick, uncomfortable confusion. "What the hell is going on here, Mitchell?" Morris demanded, striding over to his colleague. "You called in a Code 3 for 2 guys eating breakfast? You almost made us come in here shooting." Before Wyatt could formulate a lie, the deep, guttural roar of a high-performance engine drowned out the idling patrol cars outside. A completely black, unmarked Chevrolet Tahoe tore into the parking lot, ignoring the painted lines and violently hopping the curb to park directly parallel to the front doors. The driver's side door swung open. Captain Robert Sinclair stepped into the neon-lit rain. He was a massive man, standing 6'3" with shoulders that seemed to block out the streetlights behind him. He wasn't in uniform. He wore a dark, heavy canvas jacket over a plain gray t-shirt, tactical cargo pants, and scuffed combat boots. His silver hair was cut high and tight, and his jaw looked like it had been chiseled from a block of granite. He didn't run. He didn't rush. He walked toward the diner doors with heavy, deliberate, earth-shattering strides. The responding officers outside parted for him like the Red Sea, standing rigidly at attention as he passed. Sinclair didn't look at them. His eyes, burning with a terrifying, icy rage, were locked entirely on the interior of the diner. He pushed through the shattered doors, stepping over the broken bell. The remaining officers inside instantly straightened up, stepping back against the walls to give him a wide berth. Sinclair stopped in the middle of the room. He didn't look at Wyatt. Instead, he turned his massive frame toward the corner booth. The terrifying scowl on his face melted away for a fraction of a second. "Chief Washington," Sinclair said, his deep voice filling the room. Derek stood up from the booth, his posture shifting instantly from relaxed civilian to perfect military bearing. "Captain Sinclair." "Good to see you, sir." Sinclair reached out, grasping Derek's hand in a bone-crushing handshake, pulling him in for a brief, hard clap on the shoulder. "Welcome home, Derek. I heard your bird landed in Coronado on Sunday. Good deployment?" "Long, sir. But everyone came back with all their fingers and toes. That's what matters." Sinclair nodded. He looked over at Samuel, who had also stood. "Petty Officer Rivers, you're looking entirely too healthy for a man who just spent 7 months eating sand." "Good genetics, Captain," Samuel replied with a faint, respectful smile. "Sit down, both of you." "Finish your food," Sinclair commanded gently. "I apologize for the interruption to your evening." Sinclair then turned slowly, like a battleship bringing its main guns to bear. His eyes locked onto Wyatt Mitchell. The warmth completely vanished from his face, replaced by a cold, calculating fury that made the other officers in the room unconsciously take another step back. "Officer Mitchell," Sinclair said, the name sounding like a curse word in his mouth. Wyatt pushed himself off the counter, his knees visibly shaking. "See, Captain." "Sir, I can explain. They matched a description of a B and E suspect, and when I asked for ID, they handed me fakes. And—" "Stop talking," Sinclair interrupted, his voice not raised, but possessing a density that demanded absolute obedience. He walked slowly until he was standing less than a foot away from Wyatt, forcing the younger man to crane his neck upward. "You are a liar, Mitchell," Sinclair said quietly, ensuring only Wyatt and the officers immediately surrounding them could hear the venom in his words. "You have always been a liar. You pulled over 2 black men in your town because you didn't recognize them, and your pathetic, fragile ego couldn't handle the fact that they weren't intimidated by your badge." "Sir, I was following procedure." "Procedure?" Sinclair's voice ticked up a notch, echoing slightly. "Procedure is running the IDs through dispatch. Procedure is articulating reasonable suspicion. Procedure is not drawing a less lethal weapon on 2 compliant individuals who are exercising their constitutional rights while sitting in a booth eating eggs." Sinclair reached out and plucked the DoD common access cards from where Wyatt had carelessly tossed them onto the counter. He held them up. "Do you know what these are, Mitchell? Because clearly, your reading comprehension is as lacking as your tactical awareness. These are Level 4 encrypted federal identification cards. The men sitting behind you are attached to Naval Special Warfare Group 1. They operate under a security clearance that you aren't even allowed to know the name of. And you, a man who couldn't even pass the psychological screening for the National Guard, accused them of stolen valor." A low murmur of shock rippled through the other officers in the room. Sergeant Morris looked at Wyatt with absolute disgust. To cross the military in a town so closely tied to the naval bases down south was an unforgivable sin among local law enforcement. "I made a mistake, sir," Wyatt pleaded, tears of pure panic finally breaking loose and spilling down his cheeks. "It was dark. I was tired. I'll apologize. I'll write up a formal apology. Just, please, give me a reprimand. A suspension. Don't do this here." "A mistake is putting the wrong code on a traffic citation," Sinclair countered, his eyes merciless. "What you did tonight is a symptom of a rot that I have been trying to surgically remove from my precinct since I took command. You are a bully, Mitchell. You use this uniform as a shield to terrorize people you deem weaker than you. But tonight, you picked the wrong men. You tried to bully the wolves, and you got your hand bitten off." Sinclair held out his massive hand, palm up. "Your duty belt. Take it off." Wyatt gasped, a wet, pathetic sound. "Captain, please. My uncle." "Your uncle is not here to save you," Sinclair said, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "Belt." Now, with trembling, defeated hands, Wyatt unbuckled the heavy leather duty belt. The weight of it hit the linoleum floor with a heavy, depressing thud. His radio, his handcuffs, his spare magazines, and his sidearm, the physical manifestations of his power, were now piled at his feet. "Badge," Sinclair demanded. Wyatt unpinned the silver shield from his chest. He held it for a second, staring at it as if it were the only life raft in a churning ocean, before placing it into Sinclair's massive palm. "Wyatt Mitchell," Sinclair announced, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the diner. "Effective immediately. You are stripped of your police powers. You are terminated from the Oakhaven Police Department." "You can't do this," Wyatt suddenly screamed, a desperate, cornered rat lashing out. The humiliation was too much. It shattered the last remnants of his self-control. "My uncle is Councilman Robert Mitchell. He controls the police budget. He got me this job, and he'll have your badge by tomorrow morning for humiliating me like this." Sinclair didn't flinch at the outburst. Instead, a slow, dark, predatory smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a man who had perfectly executed a complex ambush. "Ah, yes. Councilman Mitchell," Sinclair said smoothly. He reached into his tactical jacket and pulled out his smartphone, tapping the screen once to wake it up. He looked at the time. "It is currently 2:45 a.m. I suppose you haven't checked your messages in the last hour." Wyatt froze, a new, colder wave of dread washing over him. "What are you talking about?" "For the last 8 months, Sinclair began, his tone conversational but dripping with lethal intent, "I have been quietly cooperating with a joint FBI and state attorney task force investigating municipal corruption in this county. Specifically, the misappropriation of city development funds and the systemic bribery involved in the new highway zoning permits." Wyatt's jaw went slack. The blood that had rushed to his face during his screaming fit drained entirely, leaving him looking like a corpse. 20 minutes ago, while you were busy playing cowboy in this diner," Sinclair continued, "federal agents served a no-knock warrant on your uncle's estate in the hills. He was arrested for extortion, wire fraud, and embezzlement of federal funds. They pulled him out of his bed in handcuffs. His assets are frozen. His political career is over, and his ability to protect you from the consequences of your own actions died the moment those feds breached his front door." The silence in the diner returned, heavier and more suffocating than before. The other officers stared at Sinclair in awe, realizing the sheer scale of the chessboard the captain was playing on. Wyatt's ultimate shield, the nepotism that had kept him employed, despite dozens of complaints, had just been obliterated. "He's gone, Mitchell," Sinclair said, stepping back and gesturing to the discarded belt on the floor. "And so are you. But we aren't done yet." Sinclair looked over at Sergeant Morris. "Sergeant, you witnessed the end of this encounter. You saw the body camera footage from when you entered?" "Yes, sir," Morris said, snapping to attention. Mitchell pointed a loaded, less lethal weapon at 2 unresisting, compliant citizens without reasonable suspicion or probable cause. He unlawfully detained them. He threatened physical violence. Sinclair looked back at Wyatt, his eyes narrowing. "Sergeant Morris, take Mr. Mitchell into custody. Charge him with 2 counts of aggravated assault under color of law and false imprisonment." Wyatt let out a strangled cry, stepping back, his hands coming up defensively. "No. No. You can't arrest me. I'm a cop." "Not anymore," Morris said, his voice hard. He stepped forward, unclipping his own handcuffs from his belt. He grabbed Wyatt's right wrist, twisting it behind the man's back with practiced, unsympathetic force. "Hey, watch the shoulder," Wyatt yelped as the steel cuffs ratcheted tightly around his wrists. "You have the right to remain silent," Morris recited, his tone carrying zero empathy. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." As Morris read the man his Miranda rights, Sinclair walked back over to the corner booth. He slid into the seat opposite Derek and Samuel, leaning his massive arms on the table. "Well," Sinclair sighed, running a hand over his short silver hair. "That is a hell of a way to start a Tuesday." Derek took a calm sip of his newly poured steaming coffee. He looked past Sinclair, watching Sergeant Morris march a sobbing, handcuffed Wyatt Mitchell out into the rain, shoving him unceremoniously into the back of a patrol cruiser. "Karma has a strange sense of timing, Captain," Derek noted mildly. "Karma usually needs a little push," Sinclair replied, tapping his finger on the Formica table. I've been waiting for Mitchell to make a mistake that his uncle couldn't cover up. Pulling a weapon on 2 Tier 1 operators on a power trip? That was the golden ticket. I appreciate you boys keeping your cool. If you had put him through the window like I know you could have, it would have complicated the paperwork. We're trying to be more gentle in our old age, sir. Samuel smiled, finally cutting into his steak again. Eat up, Sinclair chuckled. Breakfast is on me. Maggie, he called out to the waitress, who was watching the scene with wide, disbelieving eyes. Put their tab on my precinct account, and get me a black coffee, please. Yes, Captain. Right away. Maggie practically sang, visibly relieved that the nightmare that had terrorized their town for years was finally over. The harsh, fluorescent glare of the county holding cell offered none of the romantic, cinematic shadows of the night before. It was 6 a.m. Outside the reinforced cinder-block walls, the coastal sun was beginning to burn off the marine layer, casting a pale, indifferent light over the town of Oakhaven. Inside cell block C, Wyatt Mitchell sat on a rigid steel bench, his head buried in his hands. He was no longer a predator. He was a severely compromised man stripped of his armor, wearing standard-issue county orange that chafed against his skin. The adrenaline that had fueled his arrogant, terrifying rage at the diner had completely metabolized, leaving behind a profound, sickening exhaustion. Every time he closed his eyes, the events looped violently in his mind. The cold, flat stare of Chief Petty Officer Derek Washington, the chilling, unbothered tone of Petty Officer Samuel Rivers, and the earth-shattering arrival of Captain Robert Sinclair. He had expected a phone call by now. For 6 years. Whenever Wyatt crossed a line, a single call from his uncle, Councilman Robert Mitchell, to the chief of police or the district attorney, had smoothed things over. Files were sealed, complaints were dismissed as internal matters, and Wyatt was back on the street. But the one phone call privilege had yielded nothing but a disconnected tone when he tried his uncle's private cell. When he used his second call to reach his uncle's high-priced defense attorney, Simon Roth of Roth & Associates, the paralegal who answered had sharply informed him that Mr. Roth was currently at the federal courthouse in San Diego and could not be reached. The reality of Captain Sinclair's words was beginning to take root in Wyatt's panicked mind. The federal raid wasn't a bluff. Across the county, at the Federal Bureau of Investigation's San Diego field office, Special Agent Richard Evans was poring over the seized hard drives from Councilman Mitchell's heavily fortified estate. The Joint Task Force, spearheaded by Assistant United States Attorney Catherine Hayes, had been meticulously building the case for the better part of a year. They hadn't just found a few misappropriated funds. They had uncovered a sprawling, parasitic syndicate operating under the Shell Corporation Pacific Coast Development Group. The councilman had been extorting local business owners, manipulating highway zoning laws to bankrupt specific parcels of land, buying them for pennies through his shell company, and then approving massive, federally subsidized commercial developments on those exact sites. Millions of dollars had been laundered through offshore accounts. Wyatt's uncle was currently sitting in a federal holding facility, facing a 74-page indictment that included wire fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy against the United States. He was looking at 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, and his assets, including the political capital he used to protect his nephew, were frozen under the RICO Act. Back at the Oakhaven Police Department, the morning shift change was unlike any other in the precinct's history. The news of Wyatt's arrest and his uncle's federal indictment had spread through the ranks like a shockwave. Captain Sinclair stood at the front of the briefing room at 0700 hours. The room was dead silent. Every officer, from the oldest veterans to the greenest rookies, sat with their backs straight, their eyes fixed on the man who had surgically excised a cancer from their department overnight. I know the rumor mill has been working overtime since 0200, Sinclair began, his deep voice resonating off the bulletin boards. Let me deal in facts. Wyatt Mitchell's employment with this department is terminated. He is currently in county lockup, charged with 2 counts of aggravated assault under color of law, false imprisonment, and official oppression. His uncle, Councilman Mitchell, is in federal custody. Sinclair leaned against the podium, his piercing gaze sweeping over the room, ensuring he made eye contact with every single officer. For years, a shadow has hung over this department, Sinclair continued, his tone devoid of any theatricality, delivering the hard, unvarnished truth, a belief that a badge is a license for intimidation, and that political connections can shield you from the consequences of violating the oath you swore to this community. That era is dead. It died last night on the floor of a diner. We are public servants. We are bound by the Constitution, by the law, and by a standard of integrity that cannot be compromised. If any of you believe that what Wyatt Mitchell did last night was acceptable, or if you believe you are above the people you police, leave your badge on my desk before you walk out of this room. You will not be missed. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The air in the room felt cleaner than it had in a decade. Sergeant Morris, sitting in the front row, gave a barely perceptible nod of absolute respect. The purge was complete. The legal machinery moved with a swift, merciless efficiency that Wyatt Mitchell had never experienced from the receiving end. His arraignment took place 48 hours later in the chambers of the Honorable Judge Leonard Thurgood, a magistrate known for his complete intolerance of police misconduct. Wyatt, shackled at the wrists and ankles, shuffled into the courtroom. The gallery was packed. Local news reporters, citizens who had previously filed ignored complaints against him, and a few off-duty officers were present. Noticeably absent from the courtroom were Chief Petty Officer Derek Washington and Petty Officer Second Class Samuel Rivers. They didn't need to be there. They had provided their sworn, heavily redacted affidavits to the district attorney, detailing the unprovoked assault and unlawful detainment. More importantly, Sergeant Morris had logged the body camera footage from the responding officers into evidence. The video clearly showed Wyatt, sweating and panicked, his taser drawn, while the two SEALs sat with their hands flat on the table, offering no resistance, their DOD identification clearly visible. Wyatt's appointed public defender Simon Roth had officially declined to represent him, citing a conflict of interest with his uncle's federal case argued for bail, citing Wyatt's ties to the community and his lack of prior criminal convictions. Judge Thurgood peered over his reading glasses, glaring down at Wyatt with profound disgust. "Mr. Mitchell." The judge's voice echoed with the heavy timbre of absolute authority. "I have read your personnel file. I have read the sealed complaints. For 6 years, you have operated as a menace to the citizens of Oakhaven. You have used the power entrusted to you by the state to terrorize, to belittle, and to threaten. The fact that you chose to draw a weapon on two highly decorated, active-duty members of our armed forces who were simply attempting to eat a meal is not just a violation of the law. It is a profound moral failing." The judge slammed his gavel down. "Given the severity of the charges, the clear abuse of power, and the flight risk associated with the collapse of your family's financial assets, bail is denied. You will be remanded to the custody of the county until your trial." Wyatt's knees buckled. A sheriff's deputy had to catch him by the arm to prevent him from collapsing onto the polished hardwood floor. As he was dragged back out through the heavy wooden doors, he looked out into the gallery. He saw Maggie, the waitress from the diner, sitting in the second row. She wasn't smiling, but the look of permanent, low-level anxiety that usually haunted her features was gone. She looked at him not with fear, but with pity. 6 months later, the justice system delivered its final verdict. Faced with the overwhelming evidence of the body camera footage, the damning testimony of his own sergeant, and the complete evaporation of his political protection, Wyatt Mitchell accepted a plea deal. He pled guilty to felony aggravated assault and deprivation of rights under color of law. He was sentenced to 48 months in a state correctional facility. Upon his eventual release, he would be a convicted felon, permanently barred from owning a firearm, voting, or ever holding a position of public trust again. The badge he had wielded like a weapon was gone forever. His uncle, simultaneously, pled guilty to federal racketeering charges and was transferred to the Federal Correctional Institution in Victorville to begin a 15-year sentence. The local empire had crumbled into dust. Far away from the fluorescent lights of the courtroom, deep within the heavily fortified, classified perimeter of the Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado, the sun was setting over the Pacific Ocean. The air was filled with the sounds of rotor blades and the sharp, rhythmic crack of small arms fire from the distant ranges. Chief Petty Officer Derek Washington and Petty Officer Second Class Samuel Rivers stood on the tarmac, their gear bags slung over their broad shoulders. They were dressed in sterile, unmarked tactical gear, the heavy plates of their body armor absorbing the last of the day's heat. They were preparing to board a C-17 Globemaster III, the massive gray transport plane waiting to carry them back into the dark, complicated corners of the world where their highly specialized skills were required. Samuel adjusted the strap of his rifle, looking out over the water. "Did you see the email from Captain Sinclair this morning, Chief?" Derek checked the battery compartment on his night vision goggles, his face a mask of professional focus. "I saw it. 4 years for Mitchell, 15 for the uncle. The precinct is under new oversight. Karma," Samuel noted quietly. "It wasn't just karma, Sammy," Derek replied, finally looking up, the roar of the aircraft engines beginning to spool up behind them. "Karma is a passive concept. What happened was a consequence. Mitchell built a career on the assumption that power means you don't have to answer for your actions. He forgot that there are different kinds of power in this world. The loudest guy in the room is rarely the most dangerous." Derek clapped Samuel on the shoulder, the heavy Kevlar muffling the sound. "We did our job. Sinclair did his. Now it's time to get back to work. We have a brief in 20. The two men turned away from the fading California sun and walked up the heavy steel ramp into the belly of the aircraft, disappearing back into the shadows they called home. They didn't look back. The diner, the rogue cop, the small-town corruption, it was a fleeting, insignificant skirmish in the grand, sweeping theater of their lives. They were quiet professionals, and the world needed them elsewhere. In the end, the rusted neon sign of O'Connor's galley continued to flicker against the coastal fog, remaining a quiet sanctuary for the weary and the sleepless. The dramatic collision of absolute arrogance and quiet, lethal discipline served as a profound reminder that true power never has to announce itself. Wyatt Mitchell's tragic downfall was authored entirely by his own hubris. He wielded a badge as an instrument of fear, blind to the reality that the men he sought to break were forged in fires he could not comprehend. Captain Sinclair's uncompromising integrity dismantled a corrupt dynasty, proving that justice, while sometimes delayed, possesses a crushing inevitability when the right people stand their ground. While a bully faced the stark, terrifying reality of a concrete cell, the quiet professionals returned to the shadows, carrying the weight of the world with the silent dignity of those who truly serve.